Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Riddick. Now, the character of Riddick first made his debut back in Pitch Black, which I believe came out 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And I have not seen that movie in years. But it's strange because back when it was first released on VHS, I had a very brief but intense love affair with it. I thought it was awesome. It was the kind of movie which appealed to my sensibilities, and it didn't really matter if it was good or bad. The important thing was that it had lots of action, lots of gore, a few scary moments, some awesome characters, cutting-edge special effects. It was just the type of movie that would make me squee, even if it sucked. But I don't remember Pitch Black sucking, but I do believe that there is a reason why I have not gone back and given it another look. When I try to piece together what the movie was about, all the different scenes, very little has stayed with me over the years, and that's definitely a problem. I mean, it's also been about 10 years since I've watched The Matrix, but I still remember that movie very clearly. So I can't believe that Pitch Black was anything special. I'm sure it hasn't aged well either because it was very reliant on CGI, which, at the time was groundbreaking stuff, but it's just that level of CGI has gotten progressively worse over the years, so compared to what they can do now, it just looks really crummy. Probably looks like something from a made-for science fiction, the Sci-Fi Channel type movie. But there is one thing about Pitch Black that stood out with everybody: the character of Riddick. He was awesome. It was Vin Diesel's creepy performance, the moral ambiguity of the character, the fact that you never were entirely sure whether he was on the other character's side or not, whether you were supposed to root for him. Vin Diesel had a lot of charisma, so he was likable, even though this was obviously not a nice person. The character design, from the goggles to his weird eyes, that just was all incredibly awesome. And the fact that he was just a full-on badass, it really elevated that movie and to a totally different level. And originally that character was supposed to die at the end of Pitch Black, but the studios realized that there was money to be made off of this character, so they had him spared so he could appear in the sequel. So obviously, Pitch Black was a pretty big success financially, and the reviews were good enough, I guess, that they decided to bring back Riddick, but it would be a totally different kind of movie. At the time, I remember I was thinking it would be just like Aliens, where it would just be about Riddick's reoccurring battle with these monsters, but no, they totally cut out the monsters from the picture. Riddick just stole the show too much. So now it was going to transition from a medium-budgeted horror movie to big-budgeted action science fiction film. Imagine if they made a sequel to Event Horizon, but it resembled more the Star Trek reboot. That was really jarring at the time. Now, a lot of people really do hate the Chronicles of Riddick. I don't, but I don't remember especially liking it either. This is another film that very little about it has stayed with me over the years, and it came out, I think, in 2006. I could be wrong about that. But it just was an overall underwhelming experience. Not bad. It had some moments of creativity within the story or production design, but otherwise, just I thought it was very average. And that movie was a financial flop. In fact, it was kind of the beginning of the end for Vin Diesel's career for a while. Vin Diesel would end up having a comeback with when he returned to the Fast and the Furious franchise. So that obviously worked out for him, but of course, now that he's famous again, he wanted to do another Riddick movie, and this caught our attention because the filmmakers more or less acknowledged their mistakes with the previous film. They wanted to go back to its roots, where it's a hard R. I believe the Chronicles of Riddick was PG-13. It was going to be, but this new Riddick movie was going to be a hard R film that was more in line with Pitch Black than it was the Chronicles of Riddick, and it was also going to have a much scaled down budget, ensuring that the studios wouldn't interfere with the director's vision. Now, I have to admit, I was really surprised when this came out, because the last I had heard about it was they were preparing production. They were still, in the process of casting and, writing the script. And then out of nowhere, I see a trailer, so obviously this did not have a very long production schedule, or I just missed everything that went on behind the scenes. And the trailer left me with mixed thoughts. I liked how it was put together, but there were times where I was wondering if maybe they were spoiling a bit too much, and the special effects were definitely a bit iffy. The reviews came out, people were split as to whether it was good or bad, but for the most part, it seemed like people prefer it over the Chronicles of Riddick, but at the same time, it was still, a love or hated affair. Nobody was, or actually I take that back. People were still kind of in the middle. Either you didn't really like it or you liked it, but it wasn't anything special either. So I watched the movie, and it's not very good, but that never stops it from being a good time. First off, if you have not seen the trailer, consider yourself lucky, because the trailer is one of those really awful trailers in retrospect, like Iron Man 3 or The Gray, where they either spoil too much or they mislead you as to what the movie is going to be about. Now, based on the trailers, you think that it's going to be about Riddick and these mercenaries having to team up to take on a much greater threat. That's not really true, and it actually did concern me about the trailer, because I was expecting maybe a rehash of Pitch Black. It's not that at all, and I'm going to describe this movie by breaking up into its 3 different acts, sort of like what I did with You're Next, because each act is its own kind of movie, with its own kind of story. So the first act opens with Vin Diesel. He's on this barren, desolate planet. He explains how he got there. He was betrayed by the race whom he had become the emperor of in the previous film, and he was left there to die. So he's just trying to survive, and that's pretty much the entire first act, which is like for the first 20-30 minutes. Riddick is just trying to adapt to his surroundings while fighting off various aliens, and he befriends this alien dog thing that accompanies him. And I have to admit, this was a pretty compelling first act, just because it really made me appreciate Vin Diesel's charisma. He has to carry the movie on his own, and he does that incredibly well. I just love this character. I think Vin Diesel portrays him perfectly, and he brings back the edge that I think was lost in the Chronicles of Riddick. He feels much more like a dangerous killer. I think the Chronicles of Riddick made him too much into a reluctant hero, whereas Pitch Black, he was more of an anti-hero, and even that, you weren't entirely sure if he was going to end up being the villain of the picture. But here, he's back to his anti-hero roots, where he is very ruthless, but he's still likable in spite of that. The special effects are really spotty. Sometimes they look incredibly good. Other times they look too much like CGI. I loved, though, the interactions between him and his dog. It was just cute and charming. And, I was considering that was just really Vin Diesel confronting various aliens. It wasn't especially fast-paced. It was actually very leisure in how it was very leisurely paced. But it was never slow either, so I was totally into it. And then the second act occurs. Now, the second act is when the mercenaries come. Pretty much Vin Diesel, he finds this factory which allows him to communicate to the outside world, but he wants off of this rock, so he just pretty much puts his face out there. So now mercenaries are coming down to get him, and it more or less shifts from Riddick's perspective to the mercenaries. And this bothered a lot of people because Riddick is too awesome, these mercenaries are not. But to be honest, I actually thought the mercenaries were well written to a reasonable extent. I thought they were all very distinct. Each seemed to have their own personality, and their interactions themselves were enjoyable. There's 2 teams. There's one team where it's much cruder. The characters aren't as likable, but they're incredibly ruthless and vicious. Then you have another team where they seem much more professional, but they get there last, and they're pretty much being bad-mouthed by this other team, and they don't really respond. So you kind of feel that the other team is going to be the one who you really take seriously, except it turns out not to be true. The other team, it turns out to be totally, they're not even a match for Riddick, whereas this other team is somewhat more of a threat. So eventually the teams have to work together to fight Riddick. Now, once again, I liked the mercenaries, and I thought it was cool seeing Riddick, pretty much play these fools. He's not taking the situation very seriously, and his nonchalantness is just pretty funny to watch. But at the same time, one thing I did like about the first act was I felt Riddick was vulnerable. He no longer felt like this god that the Chronicles of Riddick portrayed him. But once the mercenaries come into play, you feel Riddick once again is pretty much invincible. That these guys really don't stand much of a chance in general. But my biggest problem with the second act is the special effects really start to look bad. Some of the green screen work is atrocious. I kept thinking when these guys are they're on these hover bikes, I kept thinking of Flash Gordon. That's how crude it looks. But but at least Flash Gordon had some really cool backgrounds. Here the backgrounds just don't stand out, so you're just really paying attention to how bad the special effects look. But still, it was an enjoyable, even though, some of the acting is pretty bad and some of the dialogue is very... It's the kind of movie where the dialogue thinks it's being cute and clever, but sometimes it is, but other times it's just really painful to listen to. But in a way that I have to admit I started liking, just because it's so bad that you can't help but laugh at it. One thing I really do appreciate about Riddick is whether it's being good or bad, it's always enjoyable. So it has that going for it. Now the third act is when the aliens start coming into play, and I remember being pissed off because they pretty much show the alien in full view early on. It's like this weird scorpion thing. And don't get me wrong, the aliens have a pretty nifty design. They look pretty cool. But, you saw too much of it in the beginning, which undermined their threat in the ending. So I was disappointed in that. Plus, the special effects, they just don't really look all that hot for the most part. And another thing with the trailers that spoils, like I said, certain characters' deaths. Well, some of these characters were kind of important, so way to go, movie, you spoiled that for us. But the action, it's pretty good. I still, once again, I continue to enjoy it, even though I felt the lighting was a bit too murky, the special effects were a bit too CGI-ish. But once again, the movie is filled with so many flaws, but at the same time, I enjoyed it in spite of the flaws, sometimes even because of the flaws. One thing I will say is I did not like that younger mercenary. There's this kid there, and the whole gimmick with him is that he's inexperienced, so everybody's telling him what he needs to do and telling him that he's being a moron for not knowing what to do. Well, over time, his gimmick starts to shift into him being incredibly religious, and every line of dialogue seems like it's, God is protecting me and stuff like that. And I think that he was the worst actor, that the guy who portrayed him, and the dialogue just seems so forced. Honestly, that whole character seemed only there so Riddick could say, stop talking about God. God wants no part of this. But yeah, that was pretty bad. And that's honestly really all I have to say. It's not what I'd call a good movie. The acting, the dialogue, the special effects, and even moments of the direction just kind of fall flat. But it still manages to be enjoyable enough that I could forgive those. Plus, its weaknesses start to become entertaining after a certain point. So, would I recommend Riddick? If you liked Pitch Black and Chronicles of Riddick, absolutely. If you didn't like either of those films, I'd probably wait until it comes out on DVD. But it was an enjoyable experience. I like how while I was watching it, I wasn't being a critic. I was just going with the flow, having a good time. And then, of course, after I watch it, then I start thinking about it, and I realize this wasn't a spectacular film. But sometimes it's really refreshing to watch a movie where you don't really feel the need to analyze it too much, even if it's only while I'm watching the film. So that is all I've got. If you'd like to read my written review, please check that out. It's in the link in the description, or the link can be found in the description. I also did written reviews of Phantoms, and Phantoms was that 90s horror film with Ben Affleck and Peter O'Toole. And I believe that's it. Oh, The Prodigal Son, Kung Fu flick with Yuan Bao and Sammo Hung. So read those. I plan on start working on my next episode of Critiquing the Critics this week. Whether I actually finish it, I don't know. But hopefully that will happen. And also follow me on Twitter so you can get more updates on that. So I'll see you guys later.